I wanted to talk to you today about precaution in the context of COVID, not as a matter of everyday precaution, but as a matter of how the law reacts to unknowns and how the law conceives of precaution. So, the key thing about COVID that underlies a lot of the current market reaction as well as the governmental reaction is that there is a significant amount of scientific uncertainty surrounding how COVID-19 will spread, how fatal it is going to be, how it is going to mutate, and what actions against it will in fact prove effective and what actions will in fact not prove effective against it. So you find yourself in a situation in which decisions have to be made in the face of scientific uncertainty. So to give you an illustration of this, if you look at 538.com, the statistical modeling website that started out in sports, deals in politics, well, obviously there is a market now with COVID-19 for scientific uncertainty. They have mapped out the statistical response range of experts with regard to COVID-19 in terms of how many people are going to be infected, even in the short term in the United States, how fatal it is going to be, how many people are going to be hospitalized, long term, short term. And part of what 538 shows you is that there is a significant range in which even scientific experts are projecting the disease to go. So it is this kind of uncertainty that we're now facing as citizenry, as consumers, and that our governments are facing in order to formulate a response. So how do we react to precaution? Well, we react to precaution in fundamentally different ways. The European approach coming out of environmental law has been to say that to the extent that there is scientific uncertainty, that scientific uncertainty should not be taken as a reason for inaction. This approach comes out of German constitutional law, Vorsorgeprinzip in German law, and this principle, precautionary principle, says to the extent that you ought to act in order to exercise precaution, in order to protect, then don't let scientific uncertainty stand in your way, or best do no harm, try to avoid as much as possible that which can create harm. As a common sense rule, that makes a certain amount of sense, but as American commentary in particular has shown, there is a real difficulty with that. And the difficulty that you encounter is that you start getting drawn into a problem as to, one, what is it that you're actually worried about? So to the extent that you want to have a precautionary approach, do you want to protect the ecosystem? Not relevant in this case, but relevant for the environmental source where it comes from. Do you want to protect human life? Or do you want to protect the economy? Depending as to which of these you're picking for precaution, you're going to find that the result is fundamentally different. So precaution is already driven by what is it that you want to protect. The other problem that you have with precaution is that the action that you take itself also has consequences. So there is no such thing as a consequence-free reaction to any one crisis, which means that to the extent you say, well, do no harm, better be safe itself, do no harm itself has consequences that need to be taken into account, and that, as Cass Sunstein and others have written, really fall outside the scope of the precautionary principle. Why is that? Well, part of what Cass Sunstein points out really powerfully in The Laws of Fear is that what precaution really does is it creates a heuristic, an implicit bias that is fear-driven. When we fear something, we react differently, and that limits the perspectives that we have. So part of what precaution frequently does is that it leads to a way in which we perceive information, a way in which we process information that confirms the fear that we already have, and that then drives decision-making in the same way. So that is fundamentally the problem that you run into when you talk about precaution in an environment that is as scientifically uncertain and as scary as this current situation is. So how do we get out of this problem? Well, what I do in my research about this is to say, look, you had to have discerning judgment. There are two things that I would want to recommend to you in terms of discerning judgment in order to avoid the precautionary problem. And that is, first, don't pick the worst case of the worst case modeling. Always look at the average worst case modeling as your base point for precaution. Given that we have such a wide range, there's a wide range of people to pick from. So look at 538 and other aggregators to look at what is, in fact, the average worst case scenario, and assume that that average worst case scenario is, in fact, what is the case. That is what we know. That is what we can deal with. The second point is you also have to then discerningly check what is the average worst case scenario for the action that I'm proposing, and then weigh these against each other in order to make common sense, prudent, and, it's law school, reasonable judgments. So I leave you with that thought: discerning judgment. Don't fall into heuristics. Always check the data. Do go with the worst case scenario in order to be cautious, but don't go with the worst case of the worst case. Don't fall for the outlier, of which there are many in reporting. Fall for an average, or go for an average of the worst case scenarios in order to have an appropriate understanding of what could go wrong and how we should behave to avoid it. I hope that was helpful, and look forward to discussing it with you more in the future.